A medieval farmer died beneath a mace during a lord's war. A new consciousness woke inside Luke's battered body on the same battlefield. He scavenged food and tools, then fled into mountains instead of returning to bondage. There he chose wilderness no noble controlled. Advanced knowledge gave Luke better farming, preservation, building, and engineering methods. A dirt shelter became crops, livestock, food stores, and a watermill. He gained Carpenter Ryan and loyal dog Charlie before winter. No formal kingdom existed yet, but every wall and crop finally belonged to Luke. The farmer Luke had been before death owned almost nothing outright, because even milling grain or using an oven depended on a noble's permission. Before any of that freedom existed, Luke's first life had been defined by a medieval farmer's endless obligations. His chainmail was old and rusty, but on the battlefield those 20 pounds of iron had already kept him alive through several earlier clashes. He grew crops on land controlled by a lord, surrendered part of the harvest, and paid again for basic facilities. The mace strike ended that protection instantly by attacking the one place armor could not reliably save, the head beneath chaotic close combat. Fishing required permission, milling grain cost another fee, and even common village resources existed behind someone else's authority. When consciousness returned, Luke realized the body held another man's life and memories, even though a different mind now controlled it. Then, war erased the little stability he possessed when the kingdom drafted farmers and replaced their plows with weapons. He refused to wait for philosophical answers, while armed enemies still moved nearby, choosing scavenged calories and distance over curiosity. Luke survived several battles, largely because an old chainmail vest kept blades from reaching his body. The food taken from corpses was ugly, but bread, jerky, and salted fish meant he could run farther before hunger forced another dangerous stop. That luck ended when an enemy carrying a mace landed a crushing blow against his head during another chaotic clash. Luke's first view of the mountain valley felt almost unreal after the battlefield. With green meadow, clear stream, deer, and no smoke from houses, death should have ended the story, yet Luke suddenly regained consciousness on the same battlefield that's inside a different body. He drank directly from the water because exhaustion outweighed caution, then spent several minutes simply listening for signs of pursuit or human activity. The original owner of that body was already gone, leaving Luke with unfamiliar flesh and one immediate problem: escape. No voices, bells, roads, fences, fields, or roofs appeared anywhere, giving the valley the exact isolation Luke had never possessed before. Enemies still moved across the corpse-covered field, so he wasted no time trying to understand why he had awakened inside Luke. His choice to remain was partly rebellion and partly calculation, because returning openly might expose a stranger wearing a dead soldier's body. He searched nearby bodies for anything useful, taking bread, jerky, salted fish, a shield, and basic tools before running. The rabbit snare used flexible branches as stored tension, vine as cord, and roots as bait, making it Luke's first engineered food system. Luke crossed open ground until the battle disappeared behind him, then kept moving because surviving once did not guarantee safety. Hours of waiting also taught him that trapping demanded patience, not the battlefield instinct to solve every problem through direct force. Finding fish afterward revealed how poor information could waste labor, because one stream held easier protein than the complicated trap he had just celebrated. Eventually, the landscape changed into green mountains, dense forest, clear water, and valleys, without a visible settlement anywhere nearby. Luke's first roasted meals lacked seasoning completely, turning hunger rather than taste into the reason he finished. Everything placed over the fire. He collapsed beside a stream, drank until the battlefield dust left his mouth, and finally examined the place around him. The insect-filled night made a second lesson equally clear. Survival threats were often tiny, constant, and impossible to defeat with a sword. Deer wandered near the water without panic, while the surrounding forest appeared untouched by roads, farms, or noble estates. A centipede crawling across his face finally destroyed any remaining desire to sleep uncovered, while pretending the wilderness was peaceful. That isolation gave Luke a choice he had never possessed before: return to civilization or disappear from its control. Carving the wooden shovel took repeated chopping, splitting, shaving, and smoothing, turning a basic farm tool into half a day of craftsmanship. He chose the wilderness immediately because another life under landlords, taxes, conscription, and church dues sounded worse than hunger. The improvised digging spike existed because the shovel handled loose soil well, but struggled to break the hard top layer by itself. His new territory contained no house, no field, no neighbors, and no guarantee that winter would spare him. Luke's pickaxe, spike, and shovel therefore became a primitive workflow, with each tool doing one part of a job modern equipment would combine. Still, it offered one advantage civilization never had. Nobody stood nearby claiming ownership over everything Luke might create. He dug the shelter deep because he confused a structural foundation with living space, an error only obvious after his back had already paid for it. He counted his equipment and found the beginning of a very small empire: sword, dagger, axe, pickaxe, shield, and fire striker. Rather than surrender to embarrassment, he treated the pit as insulation and designed the first cabin around the mistake instead of erasing it. Food became the first crisis. So Luke tried trapping rabbits with vine cord, bent branches, bait, and a shallow pit. The roof frame required Luke to learn basic load paths by trial, because poorly placed sagged or shifted whenever he added weight. The first rabbit eventually triggered the snare, proving that patience and simple mechanics could replace the hunting rights nobles once controlled. Every wooden connection demanded more carving than expected, especially when pegs split or holes failed to align after hours of heavy work. At the stream, Luke discovered fat fish swimming close enough to spear, making his complicated rabbit hunt suddenly feel unnecessary. Night logging felt dangerous because torchlight illuminated only a small circle, while everything beyond it remained black and unknown. He roasted both catches over an open fire, but the meal reminded him that survival without salt would become physically miserable. Luke still finished because another exposed night sounded worse than exhaustion, making stubbornness a practical survival resource rather than personality alone. The first roof stopped direct sky exposure, but did little against drafts, smoke, moisture, or animals, until later layers improved the structure. The first night exposed another problem when mosquitoes, crawling insects, and a centipede turned sleeping outdoors into constant defensive duty. His dream about seasoned food exposed how strongly the body was already craving salt, even before cramps made the deficiency more obvious. Luke barely rested before deciding that a roof mattered more than comfort, decoration, or almost anything else he could build. Luke followed deer because animals had local knowledge he lacked, turning routine wildlife behavior into a substitute for maps and survival manuals. Building shelter created a chain of smaller problems because he first needed a shovel strong enough to cut into packed earth. He marked tree trunks during the tracking trip, so excitement over minerals would not leave him wandering in circles afterward. With no blacksmith or market nearby, Luke felled hardwood and carved a crude wooden shovel, using only his knife and axe. The herd treated one particular rock face like a communal mineral station, repeatedly licking the same area before returning toward water. The work consumed hours for one primitive tool, teaching him that every simple object now required raw materials, labor, and planning. Luke deliberately avoided the wettest surface where animal tongues had been. Extracting cleaner mineral chunks from the surrounding deposit, he marked a compact shelter site and began digging a foundation deep enough to separate his sleep from surface weather. The rotten deer discovered afterward carried missing legs and organs, evidence that whatever fed there was strong enough to dismantle large prey. Hard topsoil fought every stroke, so Luke improvised additional digging tools from sharpened wood and used each one for different soil. He still recovered the antlers because natural materials had already become more useful to him than almost anything resembling decorative wealth. By sunset, he had excavated a deep rectangular pit and felt proud until a basic construction fact finally returned to him. The damaged hide required removing rotten sections before tanning, leaving Luke with less material but valuable practice before later fresh kills. A formal foundation was supposed to support a structure, not become a human-sized hole that swallowed most of the future house. His mud mixture worked because straw added internal reinforcement, while water and soil filled air gaps between rough roof poles. Filling everything back in would waste an entire day. So Luke chose the stubborn alternative and decided to live inside it. The shield's curved surface unexpectedly made a good carrier, showing that military gear could be repurposed when wilderness problems ignored intended design. He cut a doorway into the southern side, raised thick wooden posts, and planned a rough roof directly above the pit. Raw saltstone first became crushed powder, then brine, then cloudy residue, with every stage looking less promising than Luke had hoped. Repeated boiling concentrated both useful salt and unwanted minerals, which was why settling and filtering became necessary before the final evaporation. Without nails or metal fasteners, even connecting two logs required carved holes, wooden pegs, and repeated adjustments by hand. The overnight separation happened accidentally, but Luke recognized the clearer upper liquid as better material and carefully avoided disturbing the sediment. Luke worked into the night, hauling pole after pole from the forest until an uneven roof finally covered his accidental basement. His burned log container came from placing hot charcoal on wood rather than carving the entire cavity with a knife, saving hours of cutting. The shelter looked primitive, but the next sleep came without rain, stars, or insects landing directly on his face. The crude bowl also demonstrated a recurring pattern. Luke's best solutions often combined incomplete memories with materials already surrounding him. Morning brought another reminder that shelter alone was not enough when muscle cramps and bland food pointed back toward missing salt. Once salt crystals appeared, he used only small amounts, because the bitter taste warned that his purification remained far from perfect. Luke reasoned that local deer also needed minerals, so following their regular routes might reveal a natural salt source. The improved flavor also made preserved meat possible later, giving the experiment value beyond simply making fish less depressing. He waited for the herd, kept his distance, and marked trees as he shadowed them farther into unfamiliar forest. Luke collected stones excavated from the shelter rather than throwing them away, and those discarded materials became the foundation for his fireplace. The animals eventually stopped beside mineral-rich rock and began licking the surface, confirming Luke had found the resource he needed. The hearth separated burning fuel from wood walls, while thick stone absorbed heat that could continue warming the room after flames weakened. He chipped away several chunks with his pickaxe and carried them home. Though raw mineral rock was not safe seasoning yet, temporary logs inside the fireplace opening acted as a crude arch form, supporting stones until mud dried enough to hold the curve. On the return trip, the smell of decay led him toward a dead deer stripped of much of its flesh. The chimney narrowed upward, so smoke would leave through the roof instead of filling the same underground space where Luke needed to sleep. The carcass proved large predators lived nearby, destroying Luke's earlier assumption that this quiet valley was naturally safe. A flat cap above the chimney reduced direct rain entry, while still leaving enough space for smoke to escape around the sides. Rather than abandon useful material, he salvaged antlers and the remaining hide despite the smell and signs of scavenging. The raised bed protected him from cold ground and runoff, making it one of the first comfort upgrades that also improved survival. That discovery also pushed shelter construction higher on the priority list, because an open entrance X now looked like an invitation. Luke's hanging table was suspended from wooden pegs because floor space inside the pit house was too limited for normal furniture. Tools were arranged close to the bed and entrance, partly from habit, and partly because predator signs had ended any illusion of complete safety. Luke mixed dirt, water, and straw into mud, then packed the mixture between roof logs to seal gaps against weather. The antlers over the doorway changed nothing practical, yet they gave Luke the emotional satisfaction of turning emergency shelter into personal territory. He realized his round shield could carry mud far faster than bare hands, turning old battlefield equipment into construction gear. His first bath after several days removed layers of mud, sweat, dust, animal residue, and smoke that had become almost normal. The recovered deer hide required cleaning, scraping, washing, and tanning before it could become clothing or bedding later. Seeing his beard, hair, and harder physique reflected in the stream made Luke notice how quickly wilderness labor was reshaping the new body. Luke used wood ash and water for the crude tanning process because conventional leather supplies were completely unavailable. Daily exploration expanded his mental map several miles outward, identifying berry patches, mushrooms, animal trails, water, and mineral locations. Salt demanded its own experiment as he crushed mineral stone, dissolved it, boiled the liquid, and waited for impurities to separate. Small game and fish were plentiful enough in summer that the danger of future starvation could remain invisible without deliberate planning. His first attempts produced cloudy brown water rather than anything that resembled edible crystals. But Luke kept refining the mixture. Luke's previous knowledge made him think seasonally, asking what resources would disappear months before the cold actually arrived. Leaving the liquid overnight finally separated heavier contamination from clearer brine, giving him a workable path toward real salt. Grain offered compact storage, predictable calories, and future seed, making it more strategic than another pile of fresh meat. He still lacked proper containers, because one battered helmet served as cooking pot, bowl, basket, and water vessel at once. He left heavy armor hidden near the homestead during the village search, because carrying it over mountains would slow travel without obvious benefit. That limitation forced another improvised solution when Luke burned a hollow directly into a thick log to create a wooden container. The route took days because no road connected his valley to civilization, requiring river crossings, steep climbs, and nights on open ground. Charcoal slowly carved the cavity, while ash helped clean the inside, producing an ugly bowl that freed his helmet for other work. Ward Village appeared from above as only a handful of thatched roofs, surrounded by worked land, rather than any formal streets or walls. After repeated boiling and filtering, tiny crystals finally appeared in the helmet, proving Luke's improvised chemistry had actually worked. Its tiny size reassured Luke, because 20 poor villagers were less likely to involve officials than a prosperous market settlement. The first farmer's panic came from Luke's appearance rather than behavior, proving months alone had made him look much more threatening than intended. The salt tasted gritty and slightly bitter. Yet even bad seasoning transformed roasted fish into something his body desperately welcomed. Villagers positioned women and children behind the improvised defenders, making clear those 5 frightened men were risking themselves for everyone else. With immediate nutrition stabilized, Luke turned toward making the shelter less likely to burn down around him during cold nights. The chief studied Luke's stance and weapon rather than his words, recognizing immediately that the stranger had real combat experience. He stacked large stones into a hearth, filled gaps with mud, and created a contained cooking surface near the entrance. Claiming to be a poet sounded strange enough to explain travel, without inviting questions about army desertion, noble service, or identity. More stone formed rough fireplace walls, while temporary wooden supports helped him shape an arched opening above the firebox. Seed grain caused anger because those kernels were not merely food. They represented the next completing season and survival after the current harvest. Luke extended a narrowing chimney through the roof and capped it with stone, so rain could not pour directly inside. Luke's request therefore sounded to the villagers like demanding their future, rather than offering an ordinary commercial exchange. The finished fireplace was oversized and uneven, but it stored heat and reduced the chance of an indoor fire spreading uncontrolled. The salt changed the power balance because Ward residents normally produced weak substitutes from ash or paid merchants after difficult mountain travel. He also built a raised bed from stone, packed dirt, and dried straw, replacing the cold ground that had supported him earlier. Luke's several pounds of crude crystals were low quality by modern standards, but still superior to what the village could easily obtain. Antlers mounted above the entrance added no survival value, but Luke kept them because the ugly shelter finally felt personally his. The chief initially offered a much larger quantity of grain, because normal exchange rates favored salt heavily in an isolated community. 6 days after choosing the wilderness, the pit had become a home with a door, fireplace, bed, table, tools, and storage. Luke deliberately accepted less, knowing a generous first trade could create trust, and because carrying more would punish him during the return. Luke's celebrated by bathing in the stream and seeing how quickly isolation had changed his appearance into that of a rugged woodsman. His agricultural advantage came from methods rather than magical seed. So one small reserve could become more valuable, once planted under better conditions. The real achievement was not comfort, it was ownership, because every wall existed without permission from a lord or landlord. The villagers' low yields reflected exhausted soil, weak tools, limited manure, and farming traditions, optimized for survival rather than experimentation. 2 weeks into wilderness life, Luke had established routines for fishing, trapping small animals, gathering mushrooms, collecting berries, and mining salt. Luke's silently recognized techniques, such as composting and rotation, that could improve output without introducing machinery, nobody could reproduce. The chief could not spare a hoe, because iron tools were effectively extensions of a peasant household's ability to work and survive. Those routines solved summer hunger, but his memories warned that abundance in warm weather meant nothing. Once, plants stopped producing. Needles and pottery were also scarce enough that everyday objects carried economic weight. Luke's unusual knowledge made easy to underestimate. Winter became the first long-term enemy Luke could not defeat with one trap, one tool, or one lucky discovery. The hidden wheat reserve was treated almost ceremonially because white bread belonged to people with money, while common families relied on rougher grain. He needed grain that could be planted, harvested, dried, and stored, which meant eventually approaching other humans despite his desire for isolation. Less than a pound seemed laughably small to the chief, but Luke saw multiplication potential rather than immediate eating value. Luke packed food for several days, hid unnecessary chainmail near home, and crossed mountains searching for a settlement small enough to avoid trouble. Rye provided the safer bulk seed, while wheat became the experimental crop capable of producing the bread Luke missed most. After days of travel, he spotted 7 thatched huts gathered around fields, containing only a few families and almost no obvious protection. The chief believed he had made an excellent bargain because he viewed the tiny wheat packet as nearly useless compared with precious salt. A larger town would bring soldiers and officials, while this forgotten settlement looked poor enough that strangers rarely visited. Luke encouraged that belief instead of revealing how much his farming knowledge changed the calculation behind every kernel. Luke hid his axe before approaching, but his size, beard, sword, and rough clothing still made the first farmer assume banditry. Learning the region was Burgundy gave him geographic context, but the important detail was how remote these mountain settlements remained from active administration. The frightened man abandoned his hoe and sprinted towards the houses, raising an alarm before Luke could finish a friendly sentence. Ward's previous lord had died after wasting resources, and no replacement had arrived, leaving the villagers unusually forgotten by feudal systems. Within moments, villagers gathered behind 5 nervous men, holding pitchforks and sickles as improvised weapons against the threatening stranger. That vacuum made Luke more comfortable trading there, because fewer officials meant fewer questions about his background, weapons, and sudden appearance. The elderly village chief seemed to be the only person with combat experience, and his expression showed he understood their terrible odds. The village itself still survived through subsistence farming, which meant Luke needed to protect the relationship instead of exploiting their desperation. Luke lowered the tension by claiming he was a traveling poet interested only in trade, an identity safer than explaining his battlefield escape. His later decision to pay fairly for transportation and other help began with this first choice not to squeeze maximum value from salt. The puppy caught Luke's attention because companionship had become a practical mental need after weeks of speaking only to animals and himself. His first request nearly destroyed the negotiation because asking starving farmers for seed sesame sounded like demanding next year's survival. A dog also offered hearing, smell, tracking, and warning abilities Luke could never reproduce through human vigilance alone. Luke corrected the mistake by showing several pounds of homemade salt, a commodity the isolated villagers could obtain only through difficult trade. The black puppy's small size made immediate protection impossible, but raising it personally allowed training around Luke's commands and territory. The chief's hostility vanished once he understood what Luke was offering, and the discussion moved quickly inside the village. Carrying both seed and a puppy back through mountains made the return slower, messier, and emotionally far less lonely than the outward journey. Salt normally commanded far more grain than Luke could reasonably carry across the mountains, so he intentionally requested a smaller amount. Charlie's arrival marked the first real increase in population, changing the homestead from one survivor's shelter into the beginning of a household. The generous exchange confused the chief, but Luke cared less about maximizing barter value than creating a relationship he could use again. Luke still had no legal title to the land, yet nothing in sight could challenge his practical control over what he built there. His old-world agricultural knowledge suggested that good soil management could multiply the value of a small seed seed. That distinction between legal ownership and lived control would shape every later decision about whether returning to feudal society was worth the risk. The villagers had little understanding of composting, nutrient replacement, or crop rotation, leaving their yields painfully low even in decent ground. By the end of the first trade, Luke had secured 3 foundations for future growth: seed, a reliable village contact, and a companion animal. Luke therefore needed quality seed more than volume, especially because carrying a huge grain sack home alone would waste energy before planting. None of those resources solved winter alone, but together they reduced the number of problems he would face entirely by himself. The chief eventually revealed a tiny reserve of real wheat, kept inside a locked chest, along with more ordinary rye for survival planting. The journey also proved the mountains were not complete isolation. Civilization remained reachable when Luke actually needed tools, people, or information. To the villagers, the wheat amount seemed almost useless. To Luke, those seeds represented the beginning of bread he could control himself. That knowledge gave him strategic freedom, because he could avoid feudal life without severing every useful connection to it. Luke also learned the settlement was Ward Village, buried in Burgundy's mountains, and largely forgotten after its previous lord died. Returning home with Charlie and grain felt less like retreating from society, and more like choosing the exact pieces of society worth keeping. That neglect made the region attractive, because a place officials barely remembered was exactly where Luke wanted to remain invisible. For Luke, that difference was the first real sign that wilderness survival might eventually become something larger than simply staying alive. Before leaving Ward Village, Luke noticed children playing with puppies and immediately understood how useful a dog would be alone in predator country. Charlie's first nights revealed the less heroic side of companionship because a puppy could create messes faster than Luke could train him. He negotiated for a small black puppy, gaining a future hunting partner, alarm system, companion, and warm body inside one reckless purchase. Luke learned quickly that food rewards worked better than shouting, especially once Charlie understood sittings still produced immediate chicken pieces. Luke carried the animal back across the mountains with seed grain on his back and more optimism than his first journey had allowed. Every successful command reduced future risk because an obedient dog could be stopped before chasing prey, predators, or dangerous insects. He named the puppy Charlie and quickly began speaking to him like another person because complete isolation had already changed Luke's habits. The puppy still treated the forest as a playground, which made Luke keep him close whenever work carried axes, fire, or sharp stakes. Charlie was tiny, energetic, curious about everything, and far too young to provide any of the protection Luke eventually wanted. Fence construction began with straight saplings, chosen for height rather than thickness since the main goal was discouraging wolves from climbing. Even so, the puppy turned the cabin from an empty structure into a home that greeted Luke whenever he returned from work. Luke sharpened the tops, packed posts deeply, and planned enough enclosed space for future crops rather than fencing only the cabin. The wheat could not be planted immediately, giving Luke several weeks to solve another problem revealed by tracks near the river. That larger perimeter increased labor dramatically, but rebuilding later would cost even more once fields and storage occupied the surrounding ground. Wolves and wild boar clearly used the surrounding forest, meaning his exposed homestead needed stronger defenses before those animals investigated directly. Progress looked painfully slow because one morning of chopping and sharpening produced only a fraction of the material the full enclosure required. Luke planned a tall perimeter fence around the cabin and future field, using sharpened stakes packed closely enough to discourage wolves. Luke kept working because the dead deer and wolf tracks had transformed predators from vague possibility into a measured future threat. Building it required days of tree cutting, hauling, sharpening, and driving posts into hard ground, with nothing resembling modern equipment. Charlie's house training failures repeatedly interrupted sleep, making Luke add outdoor routines to the same daily schedule, already crowded with construction. Charlie followed every work session, repeatedly getting underfoot while Luke tried to turn the puppy into something resembling a trained dog. The chicken plan came from observing wild birds nearby and remembering how important eggs had been inside noble households. The first command was simple: sit. But Charlie initially treated every gesture and repeated word as an invitation to play. Unlike meat, eggs could renew daily without destroying the producer, which made two healthy birds more valuable than several one-time catches. Luke eventually switched to food rewards, physically placed the puppy into position, and repeated the lessons until Charlie connected obedience with meat. Luke's trap relied on reducing a bird's vision and movement rather than outrunning it, continuing his preference for mechanics over direct pursuit. That tiny success mattered because a large, untrained dog in the wilderness could become another problem instead of useful protection. Charlie ruined the careful stillness by wandering toward the hidden hornet nest, turning a food-gathering morning into an emergency rescue. Charlie still created immediate problems, including waking Luke in the middle of the night after using the cabin floor as a bathroom. The puppy's screams reached Luke before the insects did, giving only seconds to decide between running, fighting, or minimizing movement. House training joined fence construction on the growing list of jobs nobody includes when romanticizing independent wilderness life. Luke chose the ground because exposed movement would keep the swarm focused on them, and he wrapped himself around Charlie to cover vulnerable areas. Luke also wanted renewable food, making wild mountain chickens especially valuable because eggs could provide protein without killing the bird. The hornet's venom burned badly even through fabric, reminding Luke that chainmail and sword skill were useless against many wilderness threats. He designed a simple capture method around the bird's tendency to freeze once their vision was covered, then waited near active feeding ground. Charlie's smaller body made every sting more concerning, so Luke judged the puppy's breathing and alertness constantly after reaching safety. The hunting plan failed spectacularly when Charlie wandered away, disturbed a hidden hornet nest, and returned with an angry swarm behind him. Plant paste and rest were primitive treatment, but no healer lived within several days of travel, and waiting was the only realistic option. Luke grabbed the puppy, dropped low, covered vulnerable skin, and remained still because movement would make the attacking insects track them more easily. Luke's nighttime scouting proved the nest sat low enough to threaten anyone walking that route, making removal necessary before Charlie recovered fully. Several hornets still reached his back through clothing, while Charlie absorbed far more stings across his much smaller body. The forgotten chicken traps became an unexpected reward because 2 birds had remained captured, while Luke focused entirely on the hornets. Luke endured the burning pain until he could create smoke, using a fire striker and dry material to disrupt the swarm's senses. Securing 1 male and 1 female gave him the minimum breeding pair needed for a sustainable flock, rather than temporary meat. Thick smoke finally scattered the hornets, letting him carry the swollen puppy home before the insects could regroup. The first coop was intentionally simple because Luke still expected the birds to spend most daylight hours outside, within the fenced area. Charlie had taken more than 10 stings, but his breathing remained steady enough that Luke believed the young dog would survive. Clipping only flight feathers prevented escape without injuring the wing itself, although the chickens reacted as if Luke had committed murder. Crushed plant material became the only available treatment, while food, rest, and time handled what medieval medicine could not. Charlie's recovery let Luke shift from medical worry toward revenge planning, but he approached the insects more carefully than the first encounter. Luke did not blame Charlie for discovering the nest, because a hidden colony near daily travel routes would eventually threaten them anyway. Mud-covered skin reduced exposed scent and added a thin physical barrier beneath clothing, while armor-protected areas hornet stingers could not penetrate. That evening, he returned alone for reconnaissance, located the nest beneath a branch, and resisted the urge to attack without preparation. The deer hide layer filled gaps over chainmail and sleeves, turning Luke into a cumbersome but much safer target. While leaving, Luke checked the forgotten chicken traps and discovered 2 birds had been captured during the entire hornet disaster. He cleared grass near the future fire, so destroying 1 nest would not accidentally burn the entire forest, holding his food resources. The result gave him 1 male and 1 female, enough to begin the poultry plan, even though the day had nearly killed his dog. The nest entrance became the key tactical discovery because sealing 1 opening could neutralize hundreds of insects without fighting them individually. Luke built a small fenced chicken enclosure with shelter, straw, and a perch, then clipped flight feathers so the birds could not escape. Compressed grass worked as a plug because Luke needed something fast, soft enough to jam tightly, and disposable once fire started. The chickens reacted with predictable outrage, but their anger mattered less than keeping them alive, until they eventually produced eggs. The sentry's alarm nearly ruined everything, but Luke committed immediately, instead of retreating and allowing the entire colony to pour outside. Charlie remained swollen and exhausted, while Luke prepared for a second operation, aimed specifically at removing the hornet colony permanently. Carrying the sealed nest felt like moving a living explosive, because furious insects battered the walls from inside, while outside guards pursued. He covered exposed skin with mud to reduce scent and add protection, then layered clothing, chainmail, and deer hide over himself. Animal fat intensified the fire enough to collapse sections that initially resisted burning, preventing surviving Hornets from escaping later. The same armor that once stopped battlefield weapons now served as absurd protection against insects. But Luke preferred ridiculous to repeatedly stung. Luke noticed the strange roasted smell of burning insects, and briefly reflected on how often survival turned him into the aggressor in another creature's territory. After sunset, he cleared vegetation near the target, so any fire would remain controlled, rather than spread through the forest. That discomfort did not change the decision, because Charlie's near death had already proven coexistence beside the nest was not realistic. Luke approached slowly, noticed the nest's single visible entrance, and realized blocking that opening could trap most of the colony inside. With the threat removed, Luke reopened routes through the forest and continued fence work without constantly worrying about another swarm. He compressed grass into a dense plug, edged close enough to hear the insects, and pushed the makeshift stopper toward their entrance. Rainfall soon tested whether mud sealing had cured properly, and the roof's success gave Luke confidence his crude construction methods were improving. A sentry detected him before the plug reached position, and the nest instantly changed from quiet structure into vibrating mass of alarm. The same rain also softened exposed ground, enough to make field work easier in some places and dangerously waterlogged in others. Luke lunged forward before more insects escaped, jammed the grass into the opening, tore the sealed nest free, and ran. Luke planned planting around the season, rather than immediate hunger, waiting until conditions fit wheat and rye, instead of wasting precious seed. Outside sentries stabbed uselessly against chainmail, while Luke carried their trapped colony toward the prepared fire. His wooden tillage tools were built from hardwood, because softer wood would split once he stepped on the footbrace against compact soil. He dropped the nest onto burning fuel, and initially watched the outer material resist heat better than he had expected. The point opened deep channels. The broader tool flipped loosened clods, and the pickaxe handled roots or stones neither wooden implement could manage. To prevent surviving Hornets from escaping through weakened walls, Luke poured saved animal fat onto the fire and intensified the flames. Repeated passes broke remaining weeds and mixed surface material downward, giving Luke a crude form of soil preparation beyond simple scratching. The colony burned completely, ending a threat that had nearly killed Charlie and blocked a large section of useful forest. Every day of field work also produced more organic waste for compost, linking land preparation with a fertility system local farmers barely used. Luke felt brief discomfort recognizing the insects had defended their own home, but survival left no practical room for shared territory. Luke's compost heap combined whatever nitrogen and mineral sources he could gather, rather than depending on one ideal recipe, unavailable in isolation. Over the following weeks, Charlie recovered fully. The perimeter fence advanced, and the homestead became visibly more organized around repeated routines. Human waste was unpleasant, but too valuable to discard when one person was trying to improve soil without livestock manure. The two chickens spent much of that period fighting rather than breeding, turning Luke's renewable egg plan into another delayed investment. Wood ash contributed minerals and helped balance acidic organic material, becoming one of Luke's most versatile resources around the property. Rain also arrived frequently, testing the mud roof, pathways, storage, fence work, and every assumption Luke had made during dry weather. Kitchen scraps and river mud increased total volume, while regular turning brought air into the pile and accelerated decomposition. Instead of treating bad weather as wasted time, he continued improving drainage and planning the field that would carry his first winter grain. Charlie's attempt to eat the compost became both comic relief and a real problem because the dog could undo limited nutrient gains through one bad habit. By late summer, the planting deadline was close enough that survival agriculture finally became more urgent than additional comfort projects. Luke guarded the heap more carefully afterward, treating even his own waste like stored capital because the field needed every available source. Luke lacked an iron plow and animal power, so he created wooden digging tools inspired by older farming methods remembered from history. The deer hunt required more than meat. It was also the only realistic way to obtain enough tendon for a proper bowstring. One tool pierced and lifted compact earth with a foot brace, while another turned loosened soil after each exhausting stroke. Luke chose mating season because male aggression created predictable behavior he could exploit instead of stalking fast animals across open ground. Together with the pickaxe, they formed a slow three-tool system that could prepare land without oxen, steel equipment, or village labor. The deer-hide disguise hid some human shape, while antlers and calls supplied just enough visual and auditory provocation to trigger rivalry. Luke spent several days repeatedly turning a modest field until hard ground became loose enough to receive seed and fertilizer. Holding the pose for hours became its own endurance test, especially when Luke had no guarantee any male would approach that day. The work hurt everywhere, but each finished strip carried a psychological reward, missing from his first life, because nobody else could tax it. The dominant stag's eventual arrival revealed the danger of success, because the animal was stronger and larger than the smaller male Luke had imagined. Charlie ran through the disturbed soil chasing insects, providing no labor but enough company to make long days feel less empty. Luke did not abandon the trap because the same mass making the stag dangerous also made a deep pit more effective once momentum carried it forward. On the evening before planting, Luke stood with rye in one hand and the precious wheat reserve in the other. The fall injured the animal but not enough to hold it, teaching Luke that deep traps without internal obstacles could fail against powerful wildlife. Everything built since the battlefield now pointed toward those seeds because a winter food supply depended on what happened beneath that dirt. Three-legged movement remained fast enough to keep distance, forcing Luke to switch from trap hunting into endurance tracking unexpectedly. Before sowing, Luke addressed the fertility problem through a compost heap containing human waste, kitchen scraps, river mud, and wood ash. The damaged hoof left a unique pattern across soft ground, allowing him to relocate the stag each time forest cover broke visual contact. The mixture had not aged as long as ideal fertilizers should, so he turned it frequently to accelerate decomposition before planting season. Luke's human advantage was cooling and endurance, rather than speed, so steady pursuit eventually mattered more than winning any short sprint. One person also produced far less waste than the field required, forcing Luke to stretch the supply with every organic material available. Each time the stag paused, Luke reappeared behind it, forcing another burst of movement before the animal recovered fully. Even Charlie became a recurring nuisance around the compost pile. Trying to eat material Luke considered too valuable to lose. The final collapse came from exhaustion rather than one spectacular strike, making the hunt a demonstration of persistence as much as planning. Luke spread only a light amount across prepared ground, because poorly finished compost could damage seedlings if applied too aggressively. Luke ended the animal quickly because the goal was resources, not punishment, and the stag had already fought beyond anything reasonable. His advantage was not perfect modern agriculture. It was knowing even basic soil improvement could outperform local farming that replaced almost nothing. The return problem emphasized why settlements developed transportation technology, since a successful hunt means little if the food cannot reach storage. With the field ready, Luke returned to another survival objective that had been waiting since his first days near the deer herd. Flat planks reduced friction enough to create a crude sled, though every route and slope still punished Luke during the nighttime drag. A large fresh deer could provide meat, winter leather, tendons, bone, antlers, and the bowstring material he could not manufacture otherwise. Charlie followed noisily beside the carcass, providing company but no meaningful pulling power during the exhausting return. Luke spent several days digging a deep pit near an active route, determined to create a trap large enough for an adult animal. Warm September air forced Luke to butcher without sleep, because bacteria did not care how long the hunt or drag had taken. Passive waiting could take weeks, so he planned to attract a male during mating season, using hide, antlers, and an improvised deer call. The body's old farm experience helped Luke's hands through animal processing, even when his current mind found several steps unpleasant. The result was ridiculous but logical. Luke crouched in grass wearing deer skin and holding antlers while imitating a rival male. Tying both ends of the intestines before removal protected the meat from contamination, a small technical detail with enormous survival value. Hours passed before a massive dominant stag finally appeared, saw the apparent challenger, and responded exactly as mating season aggression predicted. Luke saved heart and liver because wasting edible organs made no sense when winter planning depended on maximizing every large kill. The animal was larger than Luke expected, with enough mass and antler spread to make a direct collision potentially fatal. The fresh hide required less aggressive cleaning than the rotted one and offered enough area for several separate leather projects. Luke held position because the pit lay between them, trusting the charging stag's momentum to complete the part he could not control. Brain tanning used material from the same animal to soften the hide, turning one carcass into both food and its own processing supplies. The stag sprinted forward, reached the disguised rival, and dropped into the hidden pit before recognizing the missing ground beneath it. Tendons were separated carefully because damage during butchering would destroy the strongest natural fibers. Luke had been waiting months to obtain. For several seconds, Luke believed 3 days of digging had solved the hunt perfectly and secured enough meat for winter. Antlers joined the earlier set as tools and decoration, while bones could become points, handles, needles, or other shaped components later. Then the wounded stag somehow jumped from the deep pit and fled on a damaged leg, turning triumph into an immediate pursuit. Limited salt forced Luke to prioritize which cuts received curing and which relied on smoke for preservation. Luke could not match a healthy deer's speed, but the injured animal left a distinctive track and tired much faster over distance. Smoking required controlled heat and airflow over repeated days, making the new drying shed a functional necessity rather than cosmetic expansion. He followed relentlessly through the forest, using human endurance instead of sprinting ability until the stag repeatedly lost ground after each rest. Luke checked meat constantly because a single spoiled batch could erase the food security created by the entire dangerous hunt. After a long chase, the animal finally collapsed from exhaustion in a clearing and could no longer continue. Once preserved, the venison represented a stored energy reserve, large enough to carry him through periods when hunting impossible. Luke approached carefully and ended the hunt with one clean thrust, respecting the animal rather than prolonging a fight already decided. The completed fence looked more serious with antlers at the entrance, though Luke had still failed to build the actual gate itself. Victory created another logistical problem, because several hundred pounds of carcass were now sitting far from his cabin after dark. That unfinished opening remained easy to ignore while no predator tested it, becoming a perfect example of deferred work hiding future cost. He returned for planks and vines, built a crude drag sled, and hauled the deer home through the night, using stubbornness more than engineering. The planting ceremony mattered emotionally, because bread was the one ordinary food Luke missed more than almost anything else. Exhaustion nearly sent Luke straight to bed, but warm weather meant delayed butchering could ruin the entire winter food plan by morning. Wheat carried social status in the surrounding world, but Luke valued it mainly because better grain meant softer bread and more flexible meals. He worked through the night removing usable organs, hide, tendons, antlers, bones, and large sections of meat as efficiently as possible. Rye occupied more field space because its resilience offered insurance if the more precious wheat failed under mountain conditions. The fresh hide was far larger and cleaner than the scavenged one, enough for bedding, clothing, footwear, and future leather projects. Luke avoided using every seed densely, preserving spacing so individual plants could access nutrients instead of competing immediately. Most importantly, the tendons finally supplied strong fibers suitable for a proper bowstring, closing a resource loop Luke had faced for months. His compost application remained light because partially fermented fertilizer could burn roots if concentrated around the newly sown area. Preservation became the next marathon because the carcass was too large to eat quickly, and Luke possessed only limited homemade salt. Rain, soil temperature, birds, rodents, and frost could still destroy the crop, so better methods reduced risk rather than guaranteeing a harvest. He cured a smaller portion with salt and smoked the majority, checking the meat repeatedly over several suits to prevent spoilage. The shift from gathering to farming also changed Luke's relationship with land, because future meals were now attached to specific planted rows. By mid-September, the homestead finally looked permanent: fenced ground, cabin, chicken enclosure, drying shed, food stores, and planted space. Fence defense gained another purpose. Once seed entered the ground, protecting not just Luke's body but months of future food production. Luke mounted the stag's antlers around the gate, partly for decoration and partly because every trophy now marked a solved survival problem. Charlie's growth meant the young dog could begin patrolling the perimeter, though Luke still controlled him closely around livestock. Inside the drying shed, rows of venison represented something even more valuable than weapons: enough calories to make winter feel possible. The chickens had become part of a broader system, where waste could feed compost, eggs could feed people, and feathers or bones remained usable. Planting day arrived after more than 2 months without bread, making the tiny wheat reserve feel almost ceremonial in Luke's hands. Nothing on the homestead functioned independently anymore. Every tool, animal, building, and field, increasingly supported several other needs. He divided the field between wheat and rye, because one promised better bread, while the other offered safer, more familiar survival grain. That interconnected structure made Luke feel less like a castaway and more like someone designing a settlement from the ground up. The soils had been loosened repeatedly and lightly fertilized, giving both crops conditions far better than the exhausted medieval fields. Luke remembered. Yet the more systems he created, the more ways one predator, storm, illness, or neglected repair could cause cascading failure. Luke planted carefully rather than densely, choosing spacing based on healthier growth instead of copying local habit and hoping for luck. The coming wolf attack would expose exactly that weakness. By targeting the one obvious gap, Luke had repeatedly postponed fixing. Every seed placed into the ground carried knowledge from another age, but nothing guaranteed weather, animals, disease, or simple mistakes would cooperate. Luke's success with crops also increased the value of defending this specific valley, instead of simply moving whenever danger appeared. Once the field was sown, Luke had transformed his existence from pure gathering and hunting into the beginnings of controlled food production. Leaving now would mean abandoning infrastructure whose construction had already consumed months of labor and nearly every useful material nearby. That transition mattered more than another successful hunt, because farming could eventually support more than one man living alone. That permanence was new for Luke, who had originally entered the mountains ready to disappear again if civilization or predators found him. Luke understood the real test would come after germination, when whether his modernist assumptions survived local conditions. By autumn, retreat had become far more expensive because the homestead contained food, seed, animals, shelter, tools, and memory. For now, he could only protect the field, preserve meat, and keep improving tools before cold weather narrowed every option. Charlie also tied Luke emotionally to the place, turning danger from a personal survival problem into responsibility for another living creature. His homestead had become stable enough that the next major weakness was no longer food or shelter, but his ability to defend it. The settlement was still tiny, but it had reached the point where failure would cost more than one man's temporary camp. That weakness would become impossible to ignore once the forest's larger predators finally stopped watching from a distance. That was why the first organized predator attack would force Luke to reconsider whether independence could continue without human help. With deer tendon finally available, Luke began building the weapon he had wanted since settling near the forests: a real hunting bow. Bow construction began with oak because Luke needed a wood capable of flexing repeatedly without becoming soft, warped, or suddenly brittle. He selected hardwood, split a suitable stave, and spent days smoothing it because rough grain could create a fatal weak point. Each rough surface had to be smoothed by stone, making the project one of the slowest improvements attempted despite its simple appearance. Without files or sandpaper, Luke used abrasive stone repeatedly, turning a simple curved piece of wood into a project lasting weeks. Luke repeatedly flexed the stave, only a little at first, training both limbs gradually so hidden grain weakness would reveal itself before full draw. The bow had to bend evenly, so he trained the limbs slowly, rather than forcing them and destroying all previous work. The process demanded restraint unfamiliar from chopping or digging, because too much enthusiasm could erase weeks of patient work in one crack. Every uneven section required more scraping, flexing, and checking until the curve stopped looking like something carved by accident. Deer tendon was split into finer strands, dried, then twisted together so the finished string could handle repeated tension without stretching excessively. Stringing the finished bow felt almost anticlimactic after weeks of shaping, because the stave simply flexed, held, and answered with a clean hum. The first successful draw told Luke the material loop was finally complete. Deer created the weapon that would make future deer easier to hunt. The first clean twang sounded like success, because a problem that had existed since arrival now had an actual solution. Bone arrowheads were inferior to iron, but they could still penetrate small game and cost nothing except time from resources already stored. Arrows created another challenge because he lacked iron heads, forcing him to shape bone points and dry straight wooden shafts. Straight shafts required careful drying because fresh wood bent or cracked, making preparation more important than simply choosing a thin branch. His first shafts snapped too easily, so Luke replaced them with better dried material and made a small usable bundle. Luke's embarrassing first shooting session proved mechanical knowledge, could build a bow, but could not transfer years of practiced hand-eye coordination instantly. The bow functioned, but Luke's accuracy did not. An entire test volley missed a rabbit that seemed almost insulting in its patience. He began shooting every day because range was the only safe answer to enemies, too dangerous to meet with a sword. He accepted that construction and marksmanship were separate skills, then added regular archery practice to an already crowded daily routine. The chicken's first eggs arrived around the same period, rewarding months of enclosure work, feed, protection, and tolerance for their constant noise. Inside the homestead, the two chickens finally stopped fighting long enough to mate and begin producing eggs. Luke boiled one in a clay pot and realized domestic food felt different from meat obtained through traps or bloodshed. He turned the first egg into simple soup, and the warm domestic meal felt closer to ordinary civilization than another roasted carcass. Charlie's larger body also changed night security because his senses now covered movement. Luke could not hear through thick walls or sleep. By then, Charlie had grown from a tiny puppy into a tall young dog with enough size to become meaningful security. The dog's warning growl before the wolf attack was the first time Luke saw trained companionship become directly life-saving rather than merely comforting. Warm shelter, preserved venison, planted grain, eggs, a dog and a bow made the wilderness feel less desperate than before. The pack remained outside the firelight, long enough that Luke could count many sets of eyes, but not distinguish every animal's position. That growing comfort ended one night when both chickens screamed, and Charlie produced a deep warning growl Luke had never heard. His unfinished gate formed a clean funnel, which was both a defensive advantage and proof that simple procrastination had created the entire crisis. A wolf howl cut through the darkness, followed by others, until pairs of green eyes gathered beyond the perimeter. Luke chose armor before stepping outside, because wolf teeth could penetrate cloth even if they could not easily defeat linked iron rings. Luke opened the door carefully and discovered a full pack, testing the homestead rather than one wandering predator passing nearby. Two animals behaved like probes, confirming the pack was gathering information rather than attacking purely from hunger. The unfinished gate immediately became the most dangerous mistake on the property because every other side was protected by sharpened stakes. One wolf's momentary hesitation, after Luke struck his shield, created the opening he needed to disable the more aggressive scout. Luke pushed Charlie back inside, put on chainmail, and chose to hold the opening rather than let wolves scatter through everything. The second scout escaped wounded, carrying information back to the pack that the human defended himself more effectively than ordinary prey. The pack did not rush blindly. Two lower-ranking animals approached first, probing Luke's reactions, while the rest watched from darkness. Rather than abandon the hunt, experienced wolves changed tactics and used repeated false charges to spend Luke's strength without risking bodies. He used the shield to smash one attacker aside and cut another badly enough to force both scouts away. The pattern forced him to rotate constantly, because attacking one side opened another, exactly like fighting several disciplined soldiers around a shield line. Instead of retreating, the pack widened around him and began alternating feints designed to drain his arms without committing to real contact. Luke eventually understood the visible large wolf was controlling attention, but he still assumes the animal itself represented the main threat. Luke recognized the tactic from human combat because the wolves were treating him like a stronger opponent who could be exhausted. Charlie's frantic direction-specific barking broke that assumption before the hidden flanker could strike completely unseen. Each failed swing made the sword heavier, while every brief pause encouraged the pack to creep a little closer. The infiltrating wolf had likely entered through the same unfinished opening earlier and remained silent, while the pack arranged pressure outside. A large visible wolf eventually stepped forward, drawing Luke's attention like the obvious leader, and preparing what looked like the decisive charge. Its attack from behind demonstrated how badly one defender could be outmaneuvered when nobody else covered blind angles. Charlie suddenly barked toward the inside of the enclosure rather than the gate, warning Luke about something directly behind him. The iron helmet transformed a potentially fatal neck or skull bite into a painful collision and disgusting mouthful of wolf saliva. A much larger wolf had slipped inside earlier and remained hidden near the chicken shelter while the pack occupied Luke outside. Luke's decision to grab the tail came from desperation rather than elegant technique. But leverage pulled the animal away before it could reposition. The concealed animal launched onto Luke's head, but its jaws met the iron helmet instead of his skull. Stomping the neck ended the hidden attacker quickly. Yet that brief focus gave the outside pack the exact moment needed to rush the gate. That impact proved the visible leader had been another distraction, while the true flanking attack came from inside his own defenses. So, multiple wolves struck chainmail and discovered teeth, could not easily reach flesh through the old battlefield vest. Luke dropped the shield, seized the hidden wolf by the tail, dragged it away, and crushed its neck before it recovered. The one successful bite landed below the armor, proving protective equipment created weak zones predators could exploit accidentally or deliberately. The rest of the pack charged during that struggle, forcing Luke into close combat against several animals at once. Luke used a small knife because the wolf was already attached to his leg, and the longer sword had too little room for a clean swing. Chainmail stopped most bites, but one wolf found the unprotected lower leg and buried teeth deep enough to tear flesh. Another attacker was pinned with the sword at close range, creating 3 deaths quickly enough to change the pack's willingness to continue. Luke answered with the hidden knife, driving it through the attacker's eye while another wolf died beneath his sword. The retreat happened in layers, because dominant animals did not flee immediately, even after lower-ranking wolves began disappearing into the trees. 3 pack members fell within seconds, finally changing the calculation for animals that had expected coordinated pressure to break him. Luke remained ready until the final large wolf vanished, refusing to assume a tactical pack would not attempt one more distraction. The survivors withdrew in stages, leaving Luke bleeding but still standing in the entrance they had failed to overrun. Only afterward did adrenaline fade enough for him to feel the damaged calf and understand how serious the punctures actually were. The fight ended with one terrifying conclusion. The wolves had tested, distracted, infiltrated, surrounded, and flanked like a disciplined hunting unit. Salt water cleaning hurt brutally, but Luke preferred immediate pain over giving dirt and saliva hours to remain inside deep wounds. Luke's immediate concern became the bite, because infection in this world could kill a man long after the animal disappeared. Wood ash and crushed plants were used because he had no alcohol, antiseptic, clean bandage supply, or doctor worth trusting nearby. Charlie repeatedly tried to lick the injury, forcing Luke to keep the worried dog away from the contaminated bite until treatment finished. The days without fever were more stressful than the actual fight, because infection could become lethal after the visible danger had already gone. Charlie tried to inspect the injury, but Luke kept the dog away, knowing saliva and dirt could make contamination worse. Displaying wolf bodies on stakes was not random cruelty. Luke wanted scent and sight to warn future predators that the compound fought back. Luke also dragged the dead wolves away from the house and displayed their bodies on tall stakes as a warning. He finally constructed the missing gate during recovery, turning the most obvious tactical failure into the first repaired weakness. The gesture was primitive, but he wanted any returning pack to associate this territory with costly resistance rather than easy food. Archery practice also became mandatory instead of optional, because Luke had seen exactly how much safer ranged kills would make another pack encounter. For several days, Luke checked the punctures constantly, expecting swelling, heat, or fever to announce an infection he could barely treat. The hidden flanker remained the most disturbing memory because animals inside his own fence had seen a threat he completely overlooked. None appeared, and the leg gradually stabilized enough for him to consider why the attack had become so dangerous. That failure made him respect Charlie's senses more and understand why human communities rely on overlapping attention instead of one exceptional individual. His first failure was obvious. Finishing the gate earlier would have removed the only direct entrance the wolves exploited. Luke did not want a crowd because crowds brought hierarchy, conflict, consumption, and the same political complications he had fled. The second was awareness, because animals, chickens, and Charlie all detected the hidden flanker before Luke noticed anything behind him. One capable partner seemed different, enough help to divide night watch and construction, without immediately turning the homestead into another village bureaucracy. The third was ranged skill. A competent archer could have reduced the pack before any wolf reached striking distance. Slavery became thinkable only because the surrounding society already treated ownership as normal and free-skilled workers had little reason to follow a stranger. The fourth problem was larger than a fence or weapon. One person could not farm, build, hunt, guard, and sleep safely forever. Luke recognized the moral contradiction, but also knew a starving purchased worker could receive better conditions with him than under many legal owners. Luke realized another reliable human could watch his back, divide labor, and prevent one overlooked threat from becoming a disaster. The trip back to Ward, therefore, served several purposes at once: sell valuable wolf fur, gather news, obtain supplies, and search for manpower. That thought forced him toward an uncomfortable medieval solution he would have rejected completely in his previous moral world. Charlie's size shocked villagers, because proper meat and care had transformed the same puppy they remembered into a muscular young animal. Slavery existed openly around the region, and buying one capable worker looked more practical than recruiting free strangers who might betray him. The chief's donkey cart offered Luke a rare chance to travel without carrying everything himself. Another reminder how much animal power mattered locally. Luke did not romanticize the idea, but the frontier had made survival decisions much uglier than simple modern principles suggested. News of campaign prisoners immediately changed his plan, because war produced a temporary market of people being treated as transferable property. Once his leg healed enough for travel, he packed trade goods and prepared to visit Ward Village again, before winter closed mountain routes. Cooper Castle sat only a few hours away by cart, far closer than the large city Luke had expected to visit for such a purchase. Charlie came along, now so much larger that villagers who remembered the puppy barely recognized the animal returning beside Luke. The road also showed increasing cultivation and settlement density, as mountain isolation gave way to managed fields under noble authority. The village chief was preparing a donkey cart for Cooper Castle and allowed Luke to join the trading trip. Luke studied the castle pragmatically rather than admiring it, noting walls, surrounding crafts, market activity, and the concentration of baronial control. During conversation, the chief mentioned recent fighting and war prisoners being sold as slaves around the castle. The tavern's combined roles as inn, meeting place, and trade hub made it the natural point for a stranger carrying valuable goods. That news eliminated the need for a distant slave market and turned Luke's uncertain plan into something immediately possible. The owner's suggestion about selling furs directly to soldiers reflected real market logic, because one shop would control price. Once Luke revealed his full supply, the road from Ward Village crossed into flatter country, where noble control became more visible with every mile. Luke accepted the introduction while remaining alert for robbery, understanding a middleman could be useful without becoming trustworthy. Cooper Castle was a practical stone-and-earth fortress, surrounded by cramped huts, taverns, and people dependent on the local baron. The blacksmith caught his eye because every iron tool visible there represented a direct reduction in labor back at the homestead. Luke rented space at the tavern, then prepared to sell wolf pelts so he could buy tools and possibly another person. The mill mattered equally because Luke still had no practical way to grind future harvest at scale once the field matured. The tavern owner advised against dumping all the valuable fur into one leather shop where a merchant could force down the price. John's house illustrated another version of medieval poverty, with people and livestock sharing enclosed space despite the smell and disease risk. He offered an introduction to a local buyer among returning soldiers, clearly expecting payment for arranging the deal. His damaged hearing from war explained the shouting, but did nothing to make the man's treatment of Ryan easier to tolerate. Luke accepted because one rabbit skin was a reasonable fee for access to customers, with coin and interest in winter fur. John wanted luxurious wolf pelts partly as social currency, hoping visible gifts could move him closer to profitable local offices. On the way, he noticed a blacksmith and a mill, two pieces of infrastructure that represented months of missing labor at home. The tavern owner's commentary revealed those offices could be dangerous traps when barons later accused successful servants of theft and seized accumulated wealth. Iron tools could turn hours of cutting or digging into minutes, while a mill would eventually determine whether planted grain became flour. Ryan entered the negotiation as background property, until Luke noticed how carefully he handled money. Despite being threatened before every task, the buyer was a loud, partially deaf veteran named John, who lived in a house shared with livestock and smelled accordingly. The boy's posture showed learned fear, but his eyes still tracked conversation and tools, suggesting intelligence. John had no reason to value. John wanted wolf pelts badly, because he hoped expensive gifts could improve his position with people connected to the baron. Learning that Ryan had survived famine before conscription explained both his malnutrition and the almost automatic way he treated food as uncertain. The tavern owner quietly explained that such advancement was dangerous because local officials often let servants accumulate wealth before confiscating everything. His capture during war converted a free craftsman's son into property through circumstances having nothing to do with ability or crime. Luke cared less about John's ambitions than the thin teenage boy ordered to bring out the household money. The story about biting John's ear proved Ryan would resist certain violations, even when resistance resulted in severe beating afterward. The boy moved carefully, kept his head down, and carried himself with more discipline than Luke expected from an ordinary farm servant. Luke interpreted that defiance as evidence the teenager had not surrendered every internal boundary, despite repeated abuse. His name was Ryan, a prisoner reduced to slavery after famine, conscription, war, and capture, stripped away his family and freedom. A carpenter's son offered exactly the technical experience Luke lacked, from wheels and joints to containers, furniture, and structural framing. Luke learned Ryan's father had been a carpenter, and the boy had grown up around furniture, wagons, beams, tools, and construction. The coincidence mattered because purchasing a random strong laborer would still leave Luke responsible for every design and skilled woodworking task. That skill set matched Luke's biggest weakness almost perfectly because his entire settlement was limited by amateur carpentry and one pair of hands. With other prisoners already shipped away, delaying the decision would mean returning to the original plan of traveling farther through dangerous country. Ryan also had enough defiance left to resist abuse, having once bitten John badly when the man crossed a personal boundary. Luke therefore treated Ryan as both a human survival case and a rare strategic opportunity available only that day. The story convinced Luke the boy was frightened, but not mentally broken. Exactly the kind of survivor who might adapt to hard frontier work. The fur-for-boy bargain made John focus on immediate profit rather than future labor value, especially because he already disliked feeding the teenager. Most recent war prisoners had already been sold elsewhere, so Ryan became the only realistic purchase available without another long journey. Luke gave up more leather than preferred, but those hides could eventually be replaced, while a skilled worker might not appear again for months. Luke changed the fur negotiation completely, offering John a lower cash value if the teenager was included in the trade. Walking away from John changed Ryan's legal owner immediately, but did not erase the boy's expectation that another household might become equally abusive. John viewed Ryan as an expense and inconvenience, making the proposal attractive despite the value of the wolf pelts. Luke's first investments after purchase were tools and clothing rather than restraints, signaling priorities Ryan did not yet know how to interpret. The haggling remained loud and unpleasant, but Luke eventually surrendered nearly all his spare leather and walked away with Ryan. The iron hoe alone could prepare soil more efficiently than Luke's entire wooden tool system. While the saw transformed building speed even more dramatically, the transaction left Luke deeply uncomfortable because a human life had been treated like another item in a market bargain. Planes and chisels mattered specifically for Ryan because they allowed the boy to use skills his father had taught, instead of only carrying heavy materials. He immediately shifted focus toward what Ryan needed to become useful, rather than how cheaply the boy had been acquired. Luke's loyalty warning sounded harsh, but it replaced arbitrary violence with a predictable rule, something Ryan's previous life rarely offered. At the blacksmith, Luke spent heavily on a real iron hoe, saw, shovel, sickle, plane, chisels, hammer, and other basic tools. Promising no casual beating, established a standard almost embarrassingly low by modern ethics, yet shockingly generous in Ryan's recent experience. The purchase nearly emptied his money, but every iron edge represented labor no wooden substitute could match. Luke's refusal of the word master came from discomfort with ownership even while he was actively participating in the same institution. Ryan watched the spending with confusion, because his new owner seemed more excited about tools than status, clothing, or luxury. Allowing the title lord created an ironic role for someone living in a crude cabin, but it gave Ryan a familiar, respectful form. Luke handed the load over, then established rules clearly enough that the frightened teenager understood what kind of household he had entered. The deerhide clothing was practical because a malnourished person produces less body heat, and winter was already closing mountain travel. He promised regular food and no casual beatings in exchange for work, loyalty, and obedience inside a dangerous, isolated settlement. Ryan's surprise at receiving useful material showed Luke that survival improvements could build loyalty more effectively than threats alone. Luke also made one boundary equally clear. Deliberate betrayal would end their relationship permanently because wilderness survival allowed little room for internal threats. Buying pottery after acquiring a carpenter later proved redundant, but Luke still needed at least one real clay vessel for cooking and boiling. Ryan accepted quickly, likely because those conditions already sounded better than the life he had known under John. Paying the chief for the ride reinforced the reputation Luke wanted in Ward. Strange, armed private, but fair enough not to fear. Luke disliked being called master and allowed the boy to address him as lord, despite owning nothing resembling a noble estate. The chief's advice to curious villagers protected Luke more effectively than any elaborate lie, because survival experience taught him not to investigate harmless mysteries. He then gave Ryan the remaining deer leather, because winter would kill an underfed teenager wearing only torn cloth. On the mountain return, Ryan's silence contrasted sharply with Charlie's constant sniffing, creating an awkward household before trust had time to grow. The boy's reaction revealed how unusual even basic concerns was for someone who had spent years being treated as disposable. The boy's willingness to touch the dog became one of the first moments he acted naturally, rather than only responding to orders. Luke used his last coins on pottery and small supplies, then rejoined the village chief for the return trip. Gathering good dry firewood showed competence immediately, giving Luke evidence that Ryan noticed quality differences other teenagers might ignore. At Ward Village, he paid for transportation despite the chief's protests, because future goodwill mattered more than squeezing every coin. The first shared stew became Ryan's real introduction to the homestead's rules, because Luke expected work, but also intended enough food to sustain it. Villagers questioned whether the heavily armed buyer of tools and slaves was really a traveling poet, but the chief refused to investigate. Waiting to be invited to eat revealed conditioning so strong that hunger alone did not make Ryan reach for a second bowl. His reasoning was practical. Luke traded fairly, harmed nobody in Ward, and asked few questions about everyone else. The moment Luke handed him equal food, began changing that conditioning more effectively than any speech about being treated differently. That mutual discretion made the Forgotten Village one of Luke's most valuable links to the wider world, without exposing his true history. Ryan's later loyalty would grow from repeated proof like meals, shelter, useful work, and predictable rules, rather than the legal document claiming ownership. The next morning, Luke, Ryan, and Charlie began the mountain journey toward a settlement the boy had never seen. Luke understood this instinctively because his own first life under nobles had taught him exactly how quickly exploitation destroys commitment. Ryan carried the new tools without complaint and rarely asked questions, habits learned from surviving people who punished curiosity. By the time they left Cooper Castle behind, Luke had traded replaceable wealth for productive capacity that could compound across every future season. Charlie treated the newcomer differently, circling and sniffing him constantly, until the boy finally relaxed himself to pet the large dog. Ryan did not understand that calculation yet, but every new tool on his back pointed toward work more skilled than anything John had allowed. By the first campfire, Luke understood the real test was beginning, turning a purchased stranger into someone who actually belonged beside him. The mountains ahead were difficult. Yet, for the first time, Luke was returning home with another person, capable of helping shape what came next. That first evening, Luke asked Ryan to gather firewood, and experienced something almost forgotten after months of doing every task alone. Ryan's first camp meal did more than fill his stomach. It established that labor at Luke's settlement would be fueled, rather than extracted. The boy returned with dry, sensible branches, chosen by someone who had grown up understanding wood, rather than merely cutting whatever looked convenient. The boy's question about nobility came from pattern recognition, because Luke's speech and confidence did not resemble the peasants. Ryan knew. Luke cooked venison stew in one of the new pots, while Ryan stared at the food with an intensity that explained his thin frame. Luke's denial remained credible, only because his clothes, possessions, and obvious lack of servants looked nothing like aristocratic life. Years of famine, military service, captivity, and deliberate hunger had trained him to wait until an owner finished before expecting leftovers. Ryan's carpentry memories became clearer once he spoke about his father, suggesting useful knowledge had survived despite famine and captivity. Luke filled a second bowl instead and told Ryan to eat while the food was hot, because tomorrow's climb would require strength. Luke immediately began thinking in projects instead of chores, because a person who understood wheels, joints, and beams unlocked completely different possibilities. The teenager hesitated before accepting, then consumed the stew with the desperation of someone whose body no longer trusted regular meals. The homestead's first reveal shocked Ryan most through the crops, not the cabin, because healthy grain contradicted everything he knew about marginal mountain farming. That moment mattered more than any formal promise, because food became the first practical evidence that Luke intended different treatment. His belief in divine blessing gave Luke a convenient explanation that protected the truth about knowledge far beyond local practice. Charlie received his own bowl, turning the camp into a strange little traveling household, instead of one master dragging property through mountains. Luke did not exploit that faith maliciously. He simply avoided introducing concepts Ryan had no framework to understand and no reason to know. Ryan eventually asked whether Luke was secretly noble because his speech, posture, weapons, and treatments of servants did not match ordinary peasants. The house discussion showed their roles taking shape naturally. Luke set objectives, while Ryan increasingly challenged bad construction ideas with practical alternatives. Luke denied it truthfully enough, pointing out that nobles usually owned estates while his current residence was still an improved whole. Postponing the full cabin prevented them from wasting good lumber on a building winter could damage before roof and walls were complete. The explanation did not completely convince Ryan, but the boy had learned that pressing questions beyond their usefulness could create trouble. The mill project demonstrated the opposite situation, where Luke possessed the concept, but Ryan possessed much of the craftsmanship needed to realize it. When Luke asked about carpentry, Ryan finally became animated and described the skills learned beside his father before famine destroyed their village. Ryan's confusion about river placement revealed how tightly local knowledge was shaped by technologies ordinary people were actually allowed to see. He knew chairs, tables, wagon wheels, beams, doors, windows, wooden bowls, buckets, plows, carts, and basic structural work. Animal-powered mills were familiar because they appeared near villages, while water power remained concentrated in places commoners rarely entered. Luke nearly laughed at how perfectly the skill matched every primitive project he had been improvising alone for months. Luke chose a modest wheel rather than an ambitious industrial design because two people needed reliability more than theoretical maximum output. Ryan even explained that several pieces of pottery Luke had purchased could have been replaced by wooden containers he knew how to carve. The river channel had to be angled carefully enough to deliver force without washing away the small structures during seasonal changes. The mistake only confirmed the value of having someone whose practical knowledge filled gaps. Luke's unusual technical understanding did not cover. The control gate also allowed them to stop the wheel for repairs, preventing constant water movement from turning maintenance into another danger. Luke told the boy directly that the wilderness would demand carpentry, farming, construction, hunting, gathering, and whatever else survival required. Ryan's joinery reduced wobble in the frame, while Luke handled heavier logs and repeated excavation around the channel. Ryan accepted the broad workload without protest, because steady work with food and shelter sounded better than being beaten while starving. The millstones were their least precise components, shaped through patient chipping until both surfaces contacted evenly enough to crush material. During the remaining journey, Luke also noticed the boy's attention improve whenever the conversation involved land, tools, or things that could be built. Testing with nuts protected future grain and gave a visible result even before harvest could provide anything valuable to grind. That curiosity suggested Ryan might eventually become more than labor if he gained enough security to think beyond immediate survival. The first rotation impressed Ryan because the machine performed continuous labor after only one human action opened the gate. When the group finally reached the homestead and stopped outside the gate and stared at what one man had assembled from forest materials, Luke recognized that free mechanical power changed economics as much as convenience, especially in a society where milling fees supported noble monopolies. The cabin, drying shed, chicken enclosure, planted field fence, stored firewood, and trophies looked crude but far beyond abandoned wilderness. A private mill also meant Luke could process grain secretly without bringing harvest volumes into settlements where officials might begin asking questions. Charlie raced inside as if returning to a kingdom, while Ryan seemed uncertain whether the place was poor, miraculous, or both. The house's expansion reused lessons from every previous mistake, showing that Luke's construction ability had improved even before Ryan's professional input. Luke showed him the crops first because the field revealed the biggest advantage advanced agricultural knowledge had created without magic or noble resources. shallower foundations, reduced unnecessary digging, while still anchoring walls strongly enough for the small structure they actually needed. The wheat and rye were developing far better than the exhausted village grain. Ryan remembered from childhood. Ryan's smooth planks made the new section visibly different from Luke's bark-covered first walls, creating an accidental timeline of skill progression. He immediately recognized the difference and struggled to explain how one man could produce such healthy growth in unclaimed mountain soil. Iron nails reduced fastening labor so dramatically that Luke finally understood why access to metal-shaped construction productivity across entire societies. Luke avoided explaining where his strange knowledge came from and simply credited careful soil work, plus a little divine favor Ryan happily accepted. Ryan's small room was placed where fireplace heat could reach more easily, correcting the draft exposure that would later still prove imperfect. The teenager crossed himself and accepted the explanation because a miracle made more sense to him than compost chemistry centuries ahead of local farming. The boy considered even that cramped room luxurious because personal space and bedding had disappeared from his life long before Luke bought him. Luke then asked whether they should begin a proper wooden house before winter, expecting the carpenter's son to finally upgrade his rough architecture. Wood storage moved under cover because damp fuel burns badly, smokes excessively, and could make an already drafty winter house miserable. Ryan surprised him by recommending delay because snowfall was too close to finish a good structure without wasting labor or leaving walls exposed. Luke stacked different sizes so kindling, ordinary logs, and larger overnight pieces could be selected without digging through one chaotic pile. Instead, he proposed expanding the existing cabin for winter and saving the proper house for a safer season. Food storage received similar organization, separating materials by preservation method and keeping moisture-sensitive goods away from damp ground. Luke accepted immediately because the advice was practical and proved he had purchased judgment rather than only an extra pair of hands. The settlement had begun developing zones for living, animals, storage, processing, farming, and power, rather than remaining one cabin surrounded by random projects. Before living space, however, Luke wanted infrastructure capable of turning future grain into flour, without paying a lord's mill fee. That spatial organization was another step towards something resembling a tiny estate, even though no legal boundary marked Luke's claims. He pointed toward the river and told Ryan they were building a mill despite having no donkey, professional millwright, or monastery. The first snowfall exposed how quickly a productive landscape could become inaccessible, making every stored resource suddenly more valuable. Ryan was confused because every mill he knew relied on animals or human labor rather than flowing water. Luke's failure to winterize the coop showed why lists and planning mattered. Once the number of responsibilities, it's what memory handled naturally. Luke understood watermills from another technological context and saw the river's steady current as free power waiting beside the homestead. The half-frozen birds survived, mainly because their screams woke him, before cold weakened them beyond recovery. The project began with a simple shed near a reliable downhill section, where diverted water could turn a wheel safely. Bringing them beside the fireplace solved temperature, but immediately created sanitation problems inside the same space, where food and people lived. Using the new saw changed construction immediately, because logs that once required long axe work could now be cut quickly and accurately. Luke corrected the coop with thicker walls, dry bedding, and more protection, instead of accepting indoor livestock as normal medieval practice. Ryan used the iron shovel so efficiently that a foundation taking Luke days alone appeared in only part of a working day. Ryan's hot water routine became another subtle health reform, reducing exposure to contaminated drinking water without needing him to understand microbes. The contrast made clear how much of Luke's early suffering had come from poor tools rather than the wilderness itself. Luke was careful not to lecture constantly, because results created obedience faster than explanations about invisible organisms nobody else believed existed. Together, they raised the basic mill structure before either man would have finished one similar stage, using Luke's original equipment. Winter meat planning returned to the boar den because preserved reserves were good, but two humans now consumed food much faster than one. Ryan handled joinery and smoothing, while Luke supplied the unusual design choices and heavy labor his stronger body could manage. Ryan's arrival, therefore, increased productive labor and winter consumption at the same time, making larger food stores necessary rather than optional. The water wheel required careful wooden segments connected around a central axle, instead of one oversized solid piece. The south also represented future agricultural danger, because one breeding family near planted land could become many crop-destroying animals by the next season. Ryan's hands moved confidently through the repetitive fitting work because wheel construction was something his father had actually taught him. Luke designed the boar hunt around the animal's temperament, expecting pain and threat to increase aggression rather than encourage retreat. They cut a narrow channel from the river and added a wooden gate so Luke could control when water reached the wheel. The deep pit gained sharpened stakes specifically because the stag had taught him a 10-foot drop alone was not enough for powerful wildlife. The grinding mechanism depended on two suitable stones, one fixed below and one rotating above through the wheel's axle. Braided vines were boiled, dried, and twisted repeatedly to produce a trip line capable of surviving contact with several hundred pounds of momentum. Finding stones flat enough created almost as much difficulty as building the wheel, because neither worker possessed true masonry tools. Ryan's role in the plan remained separate from Luke's baiting route, so one mistake would not place both people directly in front of the sow. They chipped and scraped until the surfaces could grind material without wobbling badly enough to destroy the frame. Archery practice gave Luke enough confidence to use the bow as support, though he still relied on the pit rather than pretending marksmanship was elite. For the first test, Luke poured hard nuts between the stones rather than risk precious grain that had not even matured yet. Sword drills continued because his battlefield style was practical, direct, and based on surviving actual attacks rather than formal knight instruction. He opened the water gate and watched current strike the wheel, turning the axle and spinning the upper stone under its own power. Ryan's fascination with those drills reflected a culture where combat knowledge itself functioned as protected class privilege. Powder began spilling from the edge, leaving Ryan staring at a machine that required neither animals nor people walking in circles. Luke allowed the boy to admire what was really rough veteran experience because confidence in leadership reduced fear during dangerous work. To the boy, it looked miraculous. To Luke, it was simple physics, finally freed from the monopolies that kept useful technology concentrated elsewhere. Food also improved during this period as apples, venison, roots, and eggs created meals less repetitive than the earliest weeks of plain fish. The watermill changed the settlement's future because grain could now become flour without leaving the mountains or surrendering a percentage to anyone. Ryan's appetite remained enormous, which Luke treated as expected recovery from malnutrition rather than greed or poor discipline. That independence was exactly why Luke had abandoned civilization after awakening in this body, making the machine more than another convenience. The teenager also began speaking more freely, a sign that predictable treatment was gradually replacing the defensive silence learned under John. Once the mill worked, winter housing returned to the top of the schedule, because Ryan was still sleeping on straw beside Charlie. Delegation changed Luke psychologically, because ordering one useful task allowed him to work simultaneously on another, instead of sequencing everything alone. Luke began dismantling part of the roof he had once worked so hard to finish, this time correcting several mistakes from his first construction. The multiplication of labor was the first true population benefit of the homestead, more important than simple companionship during evenings. The new section used a shallower foundation instead of another grave-deep pit, then rose above ground with proper wooden walls. Ryan's carpentry also preserved Luke's energy by preventing failed builds, reducing the number of projects that had to be dismantled and attempted again. Different floor heights forced them to add a small interior stair, producing an awkward shape that still functioned better than the original shelter. The boy learned in return from Luke's broader designs, especially agricultural and mechanical ideas absent from his father's village craft. Ryan's plane and chisels transformed rough wood into flatter planks, making doors, joints, and interior surfaces look almost civilized. The partnership therefore became complementary, rather than one-directional, despite the unequal legal relationship surrounding them. Iron nails replaced Luke's old system of carved holes and split wooden pegs, reducing long fastening jobs to seconds. Luke still maintained authority because dangerous isolation required fast decisions, but Ryan increasingly contributed information before those decisions were made. Within weeks, the cabin gained enough space for Ryan to sleep separately instead of occupying the floor beside the dog. The mill became the clearest example, combining a remembered mechanical principle with local woodworking experience. and materials from the valley. The room was still tiny, but the boy considered a private, dry sleeping place, an improvement beyond anything he expected from slavery. Luke imagined future bread each time the wheel turned, but its strategic value extended to any grain or hard material requiring repetitive grinding. Luke also built a dedicated woodshed because winter survival depended on having dry fuel nearby. Once deep snow made forest trips dangerous. Running water meant the system could work for hours with minimal effort, freeing both people for farming, building, or hunting. Both workers cut and stacked firewood until the shed held far more than daily needs, treating every load as insurance against future storms. That labor saved would matter even more if more residents ever joined, because processing food could scale without proportional manpower. Food preservation continued alongside construction, with smoked venison, dried meat, salt, eggs, berries, and gathered plants filling storage steadily. At this point, Luke still had no plan to recruit a population. Yet infrastructure was accidentally creating capacity for one. Luke's daily archery practice also continued, because the wolf attack had taught him that owning a ranged weapon meant nothing without accuracy. The expanded house similarly moved beyond emergency survival by offering dedicated sleeping space rather than one shared room around the fire. Ryan occasionally watched the drills and treated Luke's rough battlefield sword work like forbidden martial knowledge reserved for knights. Storage buildings protected reserves from weather, though the later rat problem would reveal that walls solved only some threats. Luke did not correct every assumption because being considered capable made a frightened teenage dependent feel safer in isolated territory. Charlie's growth contributed another form of labor through scent, early warning, companionship, and eventually guarding a sick person during Luke's absence. By late autumn, the field, house, mill, livestock, stores, weapons, and manpower had turned the homestead into something approaching a small estate. The chickens contributed eggs and manure, while also demanding feed, insulation, cleaning, and protection from predators. No charter recognized it, no noble title protected it, and no map even acknowledged the settlement existed. Every new asset therefore carried upkeep, teaching Luke that development meant managing systems rather than endlessly accumulating objects. That anonymity was part of its strength, because Luke gained useful infrastructure without attracting taxes, officials, or ambitious neighbors. The same lesson applied to fields, because planting created months of vulnerability before any harvest returned the original seed investment. Then the first snow arrived, covering the mountains in white and revealing how many preparations still remained incomplete. Luke's winter preparations were therefore not one event but overlapping protection for people, animals, crops, fuel, and stored food. Luke and Ryan watched from the warmer expanded cabin, while the landscape changed from productive autumn ground into frozen wilderness. The boar hunt was chosen only after those basic preparations reached a level where one dangerous expedition would not leave everything else neglected. The fireplace kept the house livable, but drafts exposed weak seams that would need repair before temperatures fell further. Ryan's fear before the hunt was rational, and Luke treated it seriously, instead of using shame to force reckless confidence. Another mistake appeared immediately, when Luke realized he had never properly winterized the chicken enclosure. Explaining the trap helped because the teenager understood his survival depended on prepared terrain, rather than winning a direct strength contest. The birds were found half frozen and pressed together for warmth, forcing Luke to carry both inside before negligence killed his egg supply. The boar den's location was known from earlier travel, reducing scouting uncertainty and letting them carry tools specifically for the valley. One night of indoor chickens covered the floor with enough waste to make emergency repairs to the coop feel urgent. Snow improved tracking but increased cold exposure, making the operation another reminder that one environmental condition can help and threaten simultaneously. Luke thickened walls, added more straw insulation, improved the floor, and created warmer water arrangements so the animals could survive outside. Ryan's pit digging with an iron shovel was vastly faster than Luke's earlier wooden excavation, validating the expensive Cooper Castle purchase again. The chickens protested their eviction after discovering the fireplace, but Luke eventually carried the unwilling birds back into their upgraded shelter. Sharpened stakes required placement wide enough to catch the boar's body without leaving a clear landing space between them. That incident reminded him that every dependent creature created another system, requiring heat, food, protection, and maintenance during winter. Luke's trip rope sat low because contact with the legs could disrupt balance more effectively than trying to stop the animal's chest. Ryan also learned one of Luke's stranger health rules. When his new lord insisted that drinking water should be heated rather than taken cold, the escape tree was selected in advance, giving Ryan somewhere safe, and Luke a backup if the pit route failed. To local habits, warm water seemed unnecessary. To Luke, boiling reduced one more source of sickness in a world without reliable medicine. Luke also carried the bow, knowing the first arrow might not kill, but any wound could further reduce the Sozau's balance before the trap. The boy obeyed despite confusion, because months of good food had already proven Luke's odd instructions often produced practical results. The cave approach remained the most dangerous phase, because an animal cornered near offspring could charge before Luke positioned himself correctly. With deep winter still approaching, Luke searched for one more large source of meat before travel and hunting became dangerous. Ryan's presence made retreat possible, ways Luke's solo hunts never allowed, because someone else could confirm direction and watch the trap area. He remembered a wild boar den discovered months earlier and worried that leaving a breeding family alone could eventually threaten both crops and people. That distributed awareness directly answered the weakness revealed by the hidden wolf months earlier. A full-grown sow would also provide hundreds of pounds of food, hide, fat, bones, and other materials worth the risk. Luke's growing settlement was therefore improving through mistakes as much as successes, with each outsy failure redesigning later plans. Ryan visibly disliked the plan, because a boar could kill an unarmored man faster than most predators they had faced. The deep pit, iron tools, gate, daily archery, partner system, and better storage all existed because something earlier had nearly gone wrong. Luke agreed that fighting one directly would be foolish, which was exactly why the hunt would depend on traps rather than courage. Even his attitude toward planning changed, becoming closer to battlefield preparation than improvisational camping. As the stakes around the homestead increased, they spent several days preparing braided vine rope, sharpened stakes, a deep pit, and a route designed around the animal's likely charge. Winter now threatened accumulated value worth defending, rather than one man carrying possessions light enough to abandon. Luke also maintained archery practice until he could at least hit a large target at useful distance instead of missing everything. Luke could still walk away physically, but doing so would sacrifice food systems, machinery, relationships, and months of compounding work. The boar operation became the first major hunt planned by two people, rather than one exhausted survivor improvising after contact. That made the coming boar hunt part of a larger transformation from mobile survivor into rooted frontier landholder. Ryan's presence changed the strategy itself, because one person could prepare the kill zone while the other handled bait, weapons, and escape. The title of Lord remained a joke to Luke, yet Ryan's use of it increasingly reflected the practical reality that one man directed a growing domain. That difference quietly confirmed Luke's conclusion after the wolves. A settlement could scale only when responsibilities stopped belonging to one man. No king had granted that authority, but neither had any king helped build the fence, mill, field, cabin, or food stores inside it. The coming hunt would test that partnership under real danger, instead of safe construction beside the river. Luke's independence existed because remoteness created a temporary political vacuum, and labor filled that vacuum with facts on the ground. If Ryan froze or misunderstood instructions, Luke could be gored before either of them had time to correct the mistake. The more infrastructure appeared, the more difficult it would become for any future outsider to dismiss the place as an accidental camp. If the plan worked, their winter food reserve would become far safer before the worst weather sealed mountain routes. Still, the source never showed Luke declaring sovereignty. His kingdom remained a figurative description of control, not an official state. Luke therefore treated every rope, stake, and escape path like battlefield preparation rather than ordinary hunting equipment. That distinction mattered because every immediate goal stayed practical: survive winter, protect crops, feed the household, and keep improving capacity. Ryan responded to that seriousness with the concentration of someone who finally had work tied directly to his own survival. The boar operation entered that practical chain as a food and land management mission rather than some symbolic conquest. Charlie stayed at home because his earlier Hornet adventure had permanently removed him from operations requiring quiet and precise timing. If the sow died, stores improved and future crop pressure fell. If Luke died, every other project immediately became Ryan's survival problem. At dawn, Luke and Ryan left the homestead for the boar den, carrying enough tools to turn one dangerous animal into an engineering problem. That simple risk made the prepared trap route one of the most consequential pieces of engineering the two had built outside the homestead. The den sat inside a valley where tracks and smell confirmed the sow still occupied the cave with several young piglets. The sow's first appearance confirmed every warning Ryan had heard, because the animal moved faster than its suggested possible. Ryan moved behind the cave and dug the main pit deep enough that even a large animal could not simply jump free. Luke's role as bait required keeping enough distance to survive, while staying close enough that the boar never switched targets. Sharpened stakes lined the bottom because Luke remembered exactly how the injured stag had escaped a deep but harmless hole. Ryan's position in the tree gave him a clear view of the trap route without exposing him to tusks during the chase. Luke stretched the braided trip rope across the sow's likely path and concealed it beneath snow where a charging animal would miss it. The trip line worked through momentum rather than strength, converting the boar's own speed into the force that threw it off balance. The final part of the plan required forcing the boar out and making certain it followed Luke instead of turning toward Ryan. Luke's missed eye shot reminded both hunters that the bow remained support equipment, not something the plan could safely depend on. He approached the cave with fire, noise, and enough provocation to turn maternal instinct into the single-minded pursuit he needed. The boar's increasing rage after injury validated Luke's behavioral prediction and made its second charge more direct than the first. The souse emerged like a battering ram, saw Luke near her piglets, and immediately redirected every ounce of aggression toward him. Ryan, hauling Luke into the tree, bought exactly the seconds needed for the sow to continue along the intended path toward the pit. Ryan had already climbed a tree near the route, giving Luke both a landmark and one person safely outside the boar's reach. The crash from beyond the trees confirmed the trap before either man could see the result, followed by screams that gradually lost strength. Luke ran across frozen ground with the animal gaining behind him, hearing each hoof strike closer than the one before. Luke still refused to climb down immediately, because wounded boars can attack violently, even after injuries that would stop many other animals. He crossed the concealed rope, spun, and prepared his bow just as the sow hit the obstacle at full speed. Finishing from above with arrows reduced risk until the sow's movement became weak enough for a final close strike. The front legs stopped while the body continued forward, flipping the heavy animal violently into the snow and buying Luke one clear shot. The dead animal represented both success and proof that their hunting methods were evolving from luck toward repeatable planning. His arrow struck the forehead instead of the eye, proving weeks of practice had improved accuracy without making him genuinely skilled. Ryan's capture of the piglets showed growing confidence because months earlier he had barely spoken unless ordered directly. The impact barely slowed the boar and only intensified its rage, which actually served Luke's plan by keeping its attention fixed forward. The small pigs were tied to a carrying pole because trying to herd terrified animals through forest at night would waste hours. The sow charged again, forcing Luke toward the tree where Ryan pulled him upward moments before the tusks reached his legs. Luke's regret over slaughtering them came from seeing future breeding value, not because winter allowed him the luxury of sentimental feeding. The furious animal continued along the prepared path and crashed into the deep pit concealed beyond the trees. Without stored fodder, a pig pen, or time for construction, keeping the animals alive would consume the same food meant to save people. Luke and Ryan approached cautiously and found the sow impaled on several stakes but still alive and fighting against the trap. Ryan's comment about craving bread after months of meat revealed how quickly scarcity can reverse once one nutritional problem is solved. Luke used his remaining arrows to weaken it from above, rather than climb into reach of tusks capable of opening his abdomen. Calling the future harvest shared wheat affected Ryan because the homestead was becoming the first place since childhood where tomorrow felt personal. Only after the movement faded did he enter the pit and finish the animal quickly with an axe strike. The wheelbarrow design solved terrain specific to mountains, where a two-wheel cart would need wider, flatter paths than the forest provided. The kill provided the largest concentrated supply of winter meat since the stag, and confirmed their two-person trap had worked. Ryan's segmented wheel construction avoided wasting one massive board and demonstrated technical knowledge Luke could not have improvised efficiently. Ryan then searched the cave and captured 4 piglets, small enough to control but still difficult to transport through snowy forest. Luke handled the simple frame because the project worked best when specialized carpentry and brute labor were divided rather than duplicated. Luke briefly considered raising them, yet winter had arrived before he could build a pen or store feed for growing pigs. The first test drive also revealed balance mattered as much as strength, which is why Ryan initially tipped the new carrier repeatedly. Keeping 4 hungry animals would simply convert existing food into another starvation risk. So the piglets became short-term provisions instead. Frozen weather helped with the carcass by delaying spoilage, turning winter from enemy into temporary refrigeration for one practical task. Ryan carried part of the load home, while Luke recognized that hauling the adult sow would repeat the same nightmare as the stag. Butcherings inside the pit saved the impossible lifting problem by reducing one huge body into loads compatible with the new wheelbarrow. This time they had a carpenter, iron tools, and one full day to build a better transportation solution before returning. Luke kept only enough hide for planned uses because processing every square foot would waste time better spent on food and shelter. Luke sketched a single-wheel carrier designed to navigate narrow forest paths where a wider cart would catch between trees. Removing intestines carefully remained one of the messiest steps, and avoiding contamination mattered even more inside a confined pit. Ryan recognized the wheel problem immediately and built the circular rim from fitted wooden sections around a central axle. The tusks had little food value, but hollow interiors made them unusual raw material Luke later converted into lamps. Luke assembled handles, platform, braces, and support pieces, while the boy completed the more specialized carpentry. Animal fat became valuable for lighting, because the household had no cheap candles, oil supply, or regular access to commercial fuel. By evening, they had a functioning wheelbarrow, one of the first machines on the Homestead created from both modern design and local craft. The first tusk lamp extended productive evening time, letting Ryan or Luke work indoors after darkness without depending entirely on fireplace glow. Luke tested it around the yard and discovered a level of maneuverability that made previous drag sleds look painfully primitive. That small change mattered during winter, when daylight hours shrank and long nights otherwise forced inactivity earlier than either wanted. The next day they returned to the pit and found the boar frozen enough that spoilage was no immediate concern. The wheelbarrows creaking under the first heavy load exposed design limits immediately, giving Ryan practical information for future reinforcement. Because lifting the entire carcass remained impossible, Luke butchered it inside the hole and passed manageable sections upward to Ryan. Luke reduced the cargo rather than destroy the machine, proving a point. Another example of experience replacing the pride of his earliest days. He kept useful hide, organs, legs, ribs, fat, and tusks, while leaving material not worth carrying through winter terrain. The expanded root cellar was meant to protect meat from temperature swings, though later it would also attract the most persistent small thieves. The loaded wheelbarrow creaked under the weight, forcing them to redistribute part of the meat before the frame failed completely. Pig fat could be rendered, meat smoked, hide reused, and bones repurposed, making the boar almost as versatile as the earlier deer. Even with limits, the device turned a brutal hauling problem into one long trip instead of several impossible drags. Ryan's parsnip discovery came from local plant familiarity rather than Luke's advanced knowledge, demonstrating the newcomer was already finding resources independently. Back home, Luke expanded the root cellar and stored the fresh pork where cold ground helped preserve it before final processing. The plant's sweet flavor mattered psychologically because medieval diets offered few naturally sweetened to people without wealth or beekeeping. The boar tusks inspired another small improvement when Luke filled the hollow interiors with rendered fat and added simple wicks. Leaving part of the wild patch untouched showed Luke's growing habit of managing renewable resources instead of stripping every discovery immediately. Those crude lamps produced warm light after sunset, transforming long winter evenings that previously ended whenever the fire became too dim. Stinging nettles offered vitamins and greens during a meat-heavy season, although Ryan's cultural association with pshmanitment made them difficult to sell as dinner. Ryan stared at the first flame with genuine wonder because artificial light beyond a hearth remained expensive for ordinary people. Luke boiled them thoroughly because heat neutralized the sting, turning a feared weed into another emergency food source. Luke saw something larger in the moment. Each ugly invention made their isolated settlement less dependent on technology controlled elsewhere. The parsnip soup thickened naturally as roots broke down, giving the meal a texture closer to hearty stew than their usual salted broth. The sow became smoked meat, dried meat, hide, tool grip material, fat, and other resources instead of one oversized dinner. Ryan's enthusiasm over the sweetness reflected deprivation more clearly than any explanation of medieval sugar prices could. Meanwhile, the winterized chickens decided the cabin was still better housing and resisted every attempt to return them permanently to the coop. By early December, stored food finally included meaningful variety, rather than simply enough calories to postpone starvation. Luke eventually caught them by hand and carried the screaming birds outside, accepting that animal management involved constant argument without language. Luke's winter confidence came from redundancy. If hunting failed, meat stores existed. If one crop struggled, roots and eggs still remained. During another gathering trip, Ryan returned unexpectedly excited about a patch of wild parsnips growing beyond the known apple area. Ryan's fever threatened that confidence because no stored resource could replace skilled labor or guarantee recovery from serious illness. Luke did not initially recognize the plant, but Ryan explained that the pale roots were starchy enough to substitute for scarce bread. Luke connected the sickness partly to cold drafts after finding weak roof sealing around the area where Ryan slept, farthest from the fireplace. More importantly to the teenager, cooked parsnips tasted naturally sweet in a world where sugar and honey were rare luxuries. He repaired the structure immediately, rather than treating illness as purely supernatural misfortune, applying cause and effect thinking wherever evidence allowed. They harvested repeated wheelbarrow loads, while deliberately leaving enough roots in the ground to preserve the wild patch for future growth. Warm liquids served both hydration and temperature support, while regular food gave Ryan energy his earlier owners might not have bothered providing. Ryan's local plant knowledge had found a major food source Luke had walked past before, proving useful knowledge flowed both directions. Luke also shared better bedding, reducing his own comfort because keeping the carpenter alive protected both a person and the settlement's productive future. Nearby stinging nettles created another opportunity because Luke knew proper cooking removed the painful effect and left edible greens. Charlie's behavior changed around the illness, becoming unusually quiet and staying close instead of demanding constant play. Ryan regarded eating punishment plants as borderline madness, so Luke gathered only a small amount, instead of forcing unfamiliar food immediately. The dog's presence gave Ryan companionship during hours Luke spent outside handling work neither of them could postpone. That evening, parsnip and dried meat soup produced the first naturally sweet meal either of them had eaten at the homestead. Heavy snow threatened young grain mechanically by pressing stalks down and thermally by exposing roots during repeated freeze conditions. The new root supply diversified a winter diet that had become heavily dependent on meat, helping Ryan's body recover from long malnutrition. Luke removed only excess accumulation because some snow could actually insulate ground, while too much weight created separate damage. December arrived with deeper snow, shorter days, stronger wind, and the first weather severe enough to make the mountains feel hostile again. Dry straw became difficult to source once winter had buried or soaked most standing vegetation, turning each bundle into a long expedition. Luke reviewed the stores and found more security than he had imagined months earlier. Pork, venison, roots, apples, eggs, salt, and fuel. Luke's rabbit fur hat, developed from necessity after repeated cold exposure, numbed ears and cheeks during those field trips. The mill, expanded house, fenced field, dog, chickens, tools, and Ryan also meant survival no longer depended on one exhausted man. The garment looked crude because warmth mattered more than tailoring, another product where function completely dominated appearance. For the first time, Luke looked at heavy snow without the same immediate fear that had haunted his summer planning. Charlie's larger body now made him useful as a guard, but less useful for entering tight places, a trade-off the later rat problem highlighted. That confidence lasted until Ryan developed fever, chills, sweat, weakness, and the kind of illness medieval families often survived only through luck. The Emerald River ice forced Luke to test weight carefully because a fall into deep-moving water could kill before anyone reached him. Luke rejected the local habit of bleeding sick people because weakening an already feverish teenager made no practical sense. He stayed close enough to the bank that retreat remained possible while chipping, rather than walking casually across the entire frozen surface. He instead focused on warmth, fluids, food, rest, and fixing the draft that had been striking Ryan's sleeping area at night. The warmer water beneath the ice reminded him that insulation does not create heat, it slows loss, a principle directly transferable to soil. The expanded roof had not been sealed as well as Luke believed, making his own construction mistake a possible contributor to the illness. Luke applied water late enough that freezing happened after absorption, rather than instantly on the surface, before reaching the roots. He added mud, straw, and insulation, while moving extra bedding toward Ryan and keeping the fireplace supplied constantly. He used measured amounts because saturation could suffocate plants or create thicker ice that damaged them instead of protecting them. Charlie took position beside the boy and rarely left, becoming an oversized black guard dog watching every movement from the bed. One pot at a time turned the experiment into exhausting labor, especially with no barrel finished before Ryan became sick. Luke's workload doubled because Ryan could no longer help with fuel, animals, cooking support, repairs, or emergency field work. The unfinished barrel itself showed how specialized some seemingly simple crafts were, requiring curved staves and precision Ryan had not completed yet. At the same time, the first serious blizzard threatened the planted wheat under snow, heavy enough to crush young growth. Luke repeatedly moved between river, field, cabin, coop, firewood, and sickbed, functioning as an entire household's labor force again. Luke began clearing excess snow from the field manually, while searching the frozen landscape for any remaining dry straw. That temporary return to solo work reminded him exactly why buying Ryan had changed productivities so dramatically when the boy was healthy. Every bundle of insulation required long walks through deep snow, leaving him exhausted before he even returned to the crops. Ryan's gradual recovery reduced the emotional pressure enough that Luke could focus on whether the field showed immediate signs of freezing damage. He layered straw over vulnerable seedlings to trap warmer air near the ground and reduce direct exposure to brutal nighttime temperatures. The wooden cross Ryan carved represented his own way of contributing hope while too weak to contribute physical labor. The task became a daily cycle of field inspection, snow removal, firewood, food preparation, animal care, and checking Ryan's fever. Luke did not mock the gesture, because it helped the teenager endure uncertainty in a world where medical explanations were limited. Winter had eliminated the illusion that stored supplies meant rest, because a settlement created maintenance demands, even when nothing new was built. The rat appeared only after the field crisis began easing, following the wilderness pattern of replacing one solved problem with another. Luke started sewing rabbit pelts into a warm cap with ear flaps, sacrificing appearance for protection during hours spent outside. Its size suggested access to abundant food, which meant the infestation had likely been benefiting from storage long before Luke noticed. Ryan politely claimed the hat looked good, which Luke correctly interpreted as, Evan said it looked terrible but functioned well. Baby rats confirmed reproduction had already started, turning one intruder into a colony problem rather than a single animal chase. Charlie had grown to roughly thigh height by then, powerful enough that Luke trusted him to remain beside Ryan while outdoor work continued. The mother's refusal to panic immediately made the situation feel almost insulting after everything Luke had sacrificed to stock the cellar. The dog also understood more complicated commands. Showing months of training had finally turned the excitable puppy into useful security. Luke's thrown dirt accomplished nothing because the rat already knew escape routes inside walls he himself had never discovered. Luke's 6-month inventory now looked almost unbelievable compared with the battlefield escape that began with a sword and a little food. Ryan's anger was grounded in childhood experience with damaged furniture, proving the rodents represented economic loss as much as disgust. He possessed shelter, farmland, a watermill, preserved stores, livestock, a carpenter, tools, weapons, fuel, and a dependable animal companion. Their first inspection found no signs inside the cabin, meaning the infestation remained localized, enough that immediate action could still protect living space. Yet every achievement still rested on fragile systems that weather, illness, predators, or one careless mistake could destroy quickly. Food odor was the obvious attraction, especially after winter concentrated months of meat and roots into one underground location. The frozen river became the next problem because normal water sources disappeared beneath thick ice during the worst cold. A cat would have provided continuous pressure on rodents, but acquiring one required travel conditions that deep winter had temporarily eliminated. Luke walked toward the Emerald River with a pickaxe, testing every section carefully before putting his full weight onto the frozen surface. Ryan's monastery suggestion gave them a future solution, while also confirming cats were rare enough locally to carry real value. He chose a thinner area near the bank and chipped slowly, because breaking the ice too aggressively could turn water collection into drowning. Charlie's nose became useful for detection, even though his large body made pursuit through narrow seltzer tunnels impossible. After opening a hole, Luke noticed the flowing water below felt warmer than the air, because the ice above acted as insulation. Moving food into the snowy yard used the freezing weather as a secure temporary storage method while they worked underground. That observation suggested another way to protect the wheat beyond straw alone. Use water itself to create a controlled frozen layer. Luke discarded contaminated meat completely because cooking could not justify gambling with rat urine, an unknown disease when other stores remained. He reasoned that carefully wetting soil late in the day could form a thin protective shell around roots overnight. Finding droppings across the lowest level revealed the animals had traveled through far more of the cellar than the first sight suggested. The idea required precise timing, because flooding plants or applying water during the wrong temperature shift could make damage worse instead. Charlie repeatedly alerted toward hidden corners, turning the dog into a living detector while Luke removed containers and inspected walls. Without a finished barrel, Luke carried river water one clay pot at a time between the ice hole and the field. The main hole was only fist-sized, but it connected the rats to an unseen tunnel system where blocking one opening could never guarantee victory. The repetition was exhausting, especially because each trip happened while Ryan remained sick, and every other chore still belonged to Luke. Luke packed rocks, sticks, and mud deeply into the passage, then added a heavy stone outside to slow immediate reopening. He watered only around vulnerable roots and allowed the night cold to convert moisture into the protective layer he wanted. Scratching from behind the plug confirmed the colony remained active and already understood its familiar route had been cut off. The method was crude compared with modern agriculture, but it applied one simple scientific principle unavailable to most farmers around him. He knew they would excavate around the blockade, because rats solve barriers through persistence, exactly the trait Luke usually admired in himself. Ryan's fever began easing during the same period, giving Luke enough relief to believe both teenager and wheat might survive the storm. The temporary seal was valuable only because it created time to prepare a more aggressive plan before another entrance appeared. When the boy could sit up again, he carved a small wooden cross and prayed over the crops. Luke had protected with practical science. Ryan's fever had broken enough by then that he refused to remain passive, while rats attacked food his own labor had helped store. Luke let him keep the explanation he preferred, because faith cost nothing, and the boy's improving morale mattered more than correcting theology. His offer to help transformed pest control into a shared problem and marked another step away from the silent, frightened boy. Luke purchased. The real emergency shifted underground when Luke entered the root cellar for pork and heard scratching from somewhere inside the wall. Luke accepted, but insisted on food and warm clothing first, because a recovered helper becoming sick again would create a worse emergency. Firelight revealed an enormous rat and several young animals beside the food stores, proving the cellar had already become an active nest. Luke returned to the cabin furious, and Ryan's disgust sharpened when he remembered rodents ruining furniture in his father's old workshop. They confirmed the living area remained clean, meaning the infestation was still concentrated around the underground provisions, rather than the entire house. A cat would have been ideal, but winter travel made finding one unrealistic, while Charlie was far too large for tight cellar tunnels. Luke therefore evacuated every surviving provision into the frozen yard, using the snow itself as temporary protection while they worked below. Charlie's nose repeatedly exposed hidden movement, helping Luke locate contaminated meat, droppings, and the fist-sized passage, serving as the colony's main entrance. Anything touched by rat urine or heavy chewing was discarded, because preserving food meant nothing if contaminated meat poisoned the household later. Luke packed the first tunnel with rocks, sticks, mud, and a heavy stone, knowing the barrier would delay rats rather than defeat them. Scratching behind the plug continued through the night, confirming the colony was alive and already looking for another path into Luke's stores. Ryan's fever had finally broken enough that he insisted on helping, especially because this particular enemy reminded him of losses from childhood. Luke fed him first and made another crude rabbit fur hat, refusing to let one recovered worker relapse during a battle against vermin. By morning, 2 fresh holes had appeared around the cellar, proving the rats could excavate faster than simple blocking could contain them. Luke changed tactics completely, deciding to use their own tunnel network against them. Instead of chasing individual animals through darkness, they placed torches for visibility and left Charlie above as backup, keeping the large dog out of the cramped underground fight. Ryan carried down the largest clay pot they owned, filled with boiling water hot enough to require thick pigskin gloves. At one opening, he lit white ash wood, whose irritating smoke could travel through tunnels and force hits away from the fire. Ryan began fanning that smoke underground while Luke positioned himself beside another exit with the heavy pot, already lifted and ready. Scratching turned frantic as the smoke spread, and panicked squeaks confirmed the animals were moving through passages, exactly as Luke had predicted. Luke held position, instead of rushing, determined to protect the winter stores without wasting the preparation that had finally given them control. As smoke filled the tunnels, Luke's wilderness domain still stood. 2 survivors, 1 dog. Livestock, crops, tools, a mill, and a home beyond any lord's command.